Hello, you're listening to Seraphim. Today I bring you another original story about hidden fortunes, broken pride, and karma that never forgets. The franchise owner stood in the courtroom, sweating through his Italian suit, when the old woman's lawyer placed a yellowed deed on the judge's bench. It was dated March 12, 1945. It bore the name Cornelius James Walker, and it proved that every brick, every tile, every square inch of the land where Marcus Whitfield had built his precious restaurant belonged to the 73-year-old widow he had tried to destroy. Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His own attorney turned to look at him with the slow, careful expression of a man who had just realized his client had lied about everything. But let me start from the beginning, because this story did not begin in a courtroom. It began with the smell of fried catfish drifting through a kitchen window on a Saturday morning in a neighborhood most people had forgotten existed. Geneva Walker woke every Saturday at 4:30 in the morning before the sun had even thought about rising. She did not use an alarm clock. Her body knew the rhythm of the work, the way a river knows the path it has carved through stone over decades. She would lie still for a moment in the dark, listening to the breathing of the house. 5 children slept in 3 bedrooms down the narrow hallway. Keisha, the oldest at 16, shared a room with 12-year-old Amara. 10-year-old twin boys, Dante and Deshawn, slept in the second bedroom, their legs tangled together like vines. And little Zuri, just 6 years old, slept in a crib that she had long outgrown, in the corner of Geneva's own room, because the child still cried in the night sometimes, calling for a mother who would never come back. Geneva would ease herself out of bed, careful not to let the springs creak too loud. Her knees ached. Her lower back carried a dull fire that never fully went out. She was 73 years old, and her body reminded her of that fact every single morning. But she did not complain. She had buried her only daughter, Lorraine, 2 years ago. Ovarian cancer. Lorraine had been 34 years old, a single mother, a woman who worked 2 jobs and still found time to braid her daughter's hair every Sunday night. When Lorraine died, the world kept spinning as though nothing had happened. But Geneva's world had stopped, and then, slowly, painfully, it had started again. Because 5 children needed to eat, she would shuffle into the kitchen in her slippers, tying her apron around her waist as she went. The kitchen was small. The linoleum floor was cracked in 3 places. The refrigerator hummed loud enough to wake the dead, and the stove had one burner that did not work at all. But Geneva kept that kitchen spotless. She wiped down the counters with bleach every night. She kept her spices in mason jars, labeled in her careful handwriting. She had a wooden cutting board that had belonged to her own mother, and she set it on the counter the same way a surgeon lays out instruments. Because cooking was serious work. Cooking was how she kept her family alive. The routine never changed. First, she seasoned the catfish. She used a blend she had perfected over 40 years. A mix of garlic powder, onion powder, smoked paprika, cayenne, salt, black pepper, and a pinch of something she never told anyone about. She dredged the fillets in cornmeal, pressing each one firmly so the coating stuck. Then she set them aside on a baking sheet lined with wax paper and moved to the next task. Collard greens. She had soaked them overnight, and now she drained them and began chopping, her knife moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. She added smoked turkey necks to the pot, a few dashes of apple cider vinegar, and a spoonful of brown sugar. The greens would simmer for hours, growing tender and rich. By the time the first light appeared through the window above the sink, Geneva had cornbread batter mixed in a cast-iron skillet and macaroni and cheese assembled in a deep aluminum pan. She made her macaroni with 3 kinds of cheese, a touch of mustard, and a layer of buttered breadcrumbs on top that turned golden and crunchy in the oven. She made sweet potato pie from scratch, whipping the filling by hand because she did not own an electric mixer. She made lemonade in a 5-gallon jug, squeezing each lemon herself, adding just enough sugar to take the edge off the tartness. Every Saturday, the same menu. Every Saturday, the same love poured into every dish. The kitchen window faced the sidewalk. It was a regular window, nothing special, with a wooden frame that Geneva had painted white 3 times over the years. But on Saturdays, That window became something else. It became a counter, a cash register, and a lifeline all at once. Geneva would set up a folding table just inside, covered with a clean tablecloth. She would stack her plates, her napkins, her forks wrapped in paper towels. She taped a handwritten menu to the outside of the window frame. Catfish plate, $8. Greens and cornbread, $5. Mac and cheese plate, $6. Sweet potato pie, $3 a slice. Full meal with lemonade, $12. The prices had not changed in 3 years. The first customers usually arrived around 10 in the morning. Mr. Henderson from 2 blocks over always came first, leaning on his cane, wearing the same brown fedora he had worn since 1987. He would tap on the window frame and say, "Morning, Miss Geneva. I hope you made extra greens today, because I am starving and I am not sharing." Geneva would smile and hand him a plate piled high, and he would press a $10 bill into her hand and tell her to keep the change. After Mr. Henderson came the Johnson sisters, who lived in the apartment complex on Elm Street. They always ordered 4 plates to go, 1 for each sister and 1 for their bedridden mother. Then came young couples, old men, church ladies in their hats, children with crumpled dollars clutched in their fists. By noon, a line would form on the sidewalk. Not a long line, not like a fancy restaurant, maybe 10, 15 people. But they stood there patiently, talking to each other, laughing, complaining about the heat or the cold or the price of gas. Geneva's kitchen window was not just a place to buy food. It was a gathering point, a place where people felt known. Geneva remembered everyone's name. She remembered their orders. She remembered their stories. "How's your knee, Mr. Patterson?" she would ask. "Did Tamika pass her exam?" she would say. "Tell your mama I'm praying for her." She fed the neighborhood, and the neighborhood, in its own quiet way, fed her back. The money was not much. On a good Saturday, Geneva might bring in $300. On a slow one, maybe $150. After the cost of groceries, after the electric bill and the gas for the stove, after she set aside money for the children's school supplies and Zuri's shoes that she outgrew every 3 months, there was almost nothing left. Geneva did not have a savings account. She did not have health insurance. She received a small Social Security check each month and a modest survivor's benefit for the children, but it was never enough. The kitchen window kept them afloat. Barely. But afloat was enough. Keisha, the oldest, helped on Saturdays. She was a quiet girl, serious beyond her years, with her mother's high cheekbones and her grandmother's stubborn chin. She would wash dishes, pack to-go plates, and hand change to customers through the window. She did not complain, though Geneva sometimes caught her staring at her phone with a longing expression, scrolling through pictures of girls her age doing things that girls her age were supposed to do. Going to movies, hanging out at the mall, wearing clothes that did not come from the church donation bin. Geneva noticed these moments, and each one was a small knife in her chest. But she said nothing. There was nothing to say that would fix it, and Geneva was not the kind of woman who wasted words. Sundays were for church. Geneva dressed all 5 children in their best clothes, which were not very fine, but were always clean and pressed. She walked them 6 blocks to Mount Calvary Baptist Church, where she had been a member for 41 years. She sat in the 4th pew on the right side, the same spot she had occupied since before Lorraine was born. Pastor Williams knew her by name. The choir mothers saved her a plate at every potluck. The deacons checked on her furnace in winter. Mount Calvary was her second family, and on Sundays, Geneva allowed herself to breathe a little easier, to close her eyes during the hymns, and feel something close to peace. The rest of the week was a blur of survival. Monday through Friday, Geneva walked the younger children to school, picked them up, helped with homework, cooked dinner, washed clothes, cleaned the house, and somehow found time to prepare for the next Saturday. She did not rest. She could not afford to rest. Rest was a luxury for people whose grandchildren did not depend on them for every meal, every permission slip signed, every nightmare soothed in the middle of the night. Geneva was tired in a way that went deeper than muscles and bones. She was tired in her spirit. But she kept moving, because that was what Walker women did. They kept moving. The house itself was a small two-story structure on Maple Avenue in a neighborhood called Glenwood Park. It had been in the Walker family for 3 generations. Geneva's father-in-law, Cornelius Walker, had bought the land in 1945 when he came home from the war with his savings and a determination to own something that no one could take from him. He built the house with his own hands, with help from his brothers and cousins. It was not a grand house. The porch sagged on one side. The paint was peeling. The plumbing made strange noises at night. But it was theirs, paid for, owned outright. No mortgage, no landlord, no one who could knock on the door and say, "Time to go," or so Geneva believed. The trouble began on a Tuesday in March when a large truck pulled up across the street. Geneva watched from her living room window as men in hard hats and orange vests began unloading equipment. They set up barriers, laid down orange cones, and started tearing up the empty lot that had sat vacant for as long as Geneva could remember. Within 2 weeks, the skeleton of a building had risen from the dirt. Within a month, the walls were up, the windows were in, and a sign had appeared on the front: Whitfield's Kitchen, coming soon. Beneath the name, in smaller letters, a Whitfield Dining Group restaurant, locations in Atlanta, Charlotte, Memphis, and Houston. Geneva did not think much of it at first. A restaurant was a restaurant. The neighborhood needed businesses. She figured it might even be good for the area, bring in some traffic, maybe help the other shops on the block. She was not a jealous woman. She did not see other people's success as a threat to her own. She had her window, her regular customers, her Saturday routine. A chain restaurant across the street was not going to change that. Or so she thought, in the way that people always think that the storm on the horizon is heading somewhere else. The restaurant opened on a Friday evening in late April. Geneva watched from her porch as a line of shiny cars pulled up to the curb. Men in suits and women in cocktail dresses stepped out, laughing and posing for photographs. There were balloons, a red carpet, a DJ playing music from a speaker system that rattled Geneva's windows. A man stood at the center of it all, shaking hands, slapping backs, grinning with a set of teeth so white they looked like they had been installed that morning. He was tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 50 years old, with a close-cropped haircut and a gold watch that caught the streetlight every time he moved his wrist. This was Marcus Whitfield. Geneva learned about Marcus from Mrs. Patterson, who had looked him up on her phone. Marcus Whitfield was the founder and CEO of Whitfield Dining Group, a franchise empire that operated 23 restaurants across the Southeast. He had been featured in magazines. He had spoken at business conferences. He drove a car that cost more than most of the houses on Maple Avenue. He had come from nothing, the article said. Raised in poverty, worked his way up, built his empire from scratch. A self-made man. A success story. Geneva listened to all of this and nodded politely, because she had learned long ago that a man's story about himself and the truth about that man were often 2 very different things. The first Saturday after Whitfield's Kitchen opened, Geneva noticed something. Her line was shorter. Not dramatically, but enough. Instead of 15 people waiting on the sidewalk, there were 10. A few of her regulars were missing. She told herself it was just curiosity, people wanting to try the new place. They would come back. They always came back. Her catfish was better than anything that came out of a franchise kitchen, and she knew it. She seasoned every fillet with her own hands. Marcus Whitfield probably had never touched a piece of raw fish in his life. But the next Saturday, the line was shorter still. 8 people, then 6. Then, on the 4th Saturday after the restaurant opened, Geneva counted only 4 customers by noon. She stood at her window with a full tray of catfish going cold and a pot of greens that no one was eating, and for the first time, she felt a flutter of something she did not want to name. It was not anger, it was not fear, it was something quieter. It was the sound of the floor shifting beneath her feet, and she did not know where she would land. She wrapped the leftover food in foil and put it in the refrigerator. The children would eat well that week at least. But the money was a problem. It was Keisha who first told her what was happening. The girl came home from school one afternoon with a strange expression on her face, a mix of confusion and protective fury that made her look exactly like her mother had looked when something was wrong. She dropped her backpack on the kitchen table and stood there, arms folded, jaw tight. Geneva was peeling potatoes at the sink and did not turn around right away. She could feel the weight of whatever Keisha was about to say, pressing against the back of her neck like a hand. "Grandma," Keisha said, "Marcus Whitfield is telling people not to eat your food." Geneva set down the peeler and turned slowly. "What do you mean, baby?" "Tasha Jackson told me at school. Her mom went to eat at Whitfield's last Saturday, and Marcus himself came to her table. He told her she should be careful about buying food from that kitchen window across the street. He said it wasn't inspected, it wasn't safe. He said you probably had roaches." Keisha's voice cracked on the last word, and her eyes filled with tears that she blinked away fiercely. "He's lying, Grandma. He's a liar." Geneva felt the blood drain from her face, slow and cold, like someone had pulled a plug at the base of her skull. She reached for the edge of the counter and held on. Roaches. He had said roaches. She kept her kitchen cleaner than a hospital. She had never, not once in 40 years, served a plate of food she would not eat herself. The insult was not just personal. It was an attack on everything she had built, everything she had poured herself into since long before Marcus Whitfield had learned how to spell the word franchise.
"Who else did he tell?" Geneva asked, keeping her voice steady.
Keisha wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. "I don't know, Grandma, but Tasha said her mom isn't coming back to buy plates anymore. She said she doesn't want to take the risk." The girl's chin trembled. "It's not fair. Your food is better than his. Everybody knows that." Geneva crossed the kitchen and pulled Keisha into a hug. The girl was almost as tall as she was now, and Geneva could feel the tension in her shoulders, the rigid anger of a child who had been forced to grow up too fast and still could not protect the person she loved most. Geneva held her and said nothing for a long moment. She stroked the girl's braids and looked out the kitchen window at the bright sign glowing across the street. Whitfield's Kitchen. The name blazed in red and gold, cheerful and confident, like a fist wearing a glove. "Don't you worry about Mr. Whitfield," Geneva said quietly. "The truth always comes out. It may take its time, but it always comes out." But the truth, as Geneva would learn, sometimes needed a push. The following Tuesday, a white van pulled up in front of Geneva's house. Two people got out, a man in a polo shirt carrying a clipboard and a woman holding a camera. They walked up the porch steps and knocked on the front door. Geneva opened it, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and found herself looking at a laminated ID badge clipped to the man's shirt pocket. Glenwood County Health Department. The man's name was Brian Teller. He was young, maybe 30, with a nervous energy about him, like a person who did not enjoy the job he was about to do. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "we've received a complaint about food being sold from this address without a proper food handler's permit and without a licensed commercial kitchen. We're here to conduct an inspection." Geneva's hand tightened on the dish towel. The cotton twisted between her fingers, rough against her skin. She looked past Brian Teller to the woman with the camera, who was already taking pictures of the exterior of the house, the kitchen window, the folding table visible through the glass. The woman did not make eye contact. She just kept clicking, the shutter sound cutting through the quiet afternoon like scissors through fabric. "Who filed the complaint?" Geneva asked. Brian Teller glanced down at his clipboard and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that, ma'am, but we are required to follow up on all complaints. May we come inside and take a look at your kitchen?" Geneva stepped aside and let them in, because she had nothing to hide. Her kitchen was clean. Her food was safe. She had been cooking for this neighborhood for longer than Brian Teller had been alive, and no one had ever gotten sick, not once. She stood in the doorway of her own kitchen and watched a stranger open her refrigerator, check the temperature of her stove, peer at the expiration dates on her spices, and take photographs of everything. The woman aimed her camera at the cracked linoleum floor, at the gap beneath the back door where the weather stripping had worn away, at the frayed cord on the toaster. She photographed the things that were broken and skipped the things that were clean. Brian Teller wrote on his clipboard for a long time. Then he looked up and gave Geneva a tight, unhappy smile. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that selling prepared food from a residential kitchen without a food handler's license and a commercial kitchen permit is a violation of County Health Code Section 14-208. We're issuing a cease and desist order effective immediately. You are not permitted to sell food from this location until you obtain the proper licensing and your kitchen passes a commercial-grade inspection." The words hit Geneva like a slap delivered in slow motion. She felt each one land separately. Cease and desist. The dish towel slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. She looked down at it and then back up at Brian Teller, who had the decency to look uncomfortable. The woman with the camera was still clicking. "That window has fed this neighborhood for 7 years, Geneva said. Her voice was quiet but firm, the voice of a woman who had survived enough to know that falling apart was not an option. "Nobody has ever gotten sick from my food. You can ask anyone on this block." "I understand, ma'am, and I'm sorry," Brian said. "But the law is the law. If you'd like to apply for the proper permits, I can leave you the paperwork." He set a stack of forms on her kitchen table, next to Zuri's coloring book and a cup of juice with a bendy straw. Then he and the camera woman left, and Geneva stood alone in her kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Marcus Whitfield's restaurant music drifting across the street. She did not cry. She wanted to, but she did not. Crying was something she saved for late at night, when the children were asleep and the house was dark and no one could see or hear her. Right now, in the bright kitchen, with the afternoon light streaming through the window, she simply stood still and breathed. In and out. In and out. The way she had breathed the day they told her Lorraine was gone. The way she had breathed every time life tried to knock her down. She breathed and she stayed standing. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the stack of forms spread out before her. The paperwork was dense, full of codes and regulations and fees. A food handler's license required a course and an exam. A commercial kitchen permit required upgrades, a separate hand-washing sink, stainless steel surfaces, a ventilation hood that met specific standards, a grease trap. The estimated cost of the renovations, according to a handout Brian Teller had included, ranged from $8,000 to $15,000. Geneva read that number 3 times. Then she set the paper down and pressed her palms flat against the table. $8,000. She did not have $800. She did not have 80. Keisha appeared in the doorway, holding Zuri on her hip. The little girl was sleepy, her head resting against Keisha's shoulder, her thumb close to her mouth. Keisha looked at the papers on the table and then at her grandmother's face, and Geneva watched her oldest grandchild's expression shift from curiosity to understanding to something hard and old. Something no 16-year-old should carry. "He did this," Keisha said. It was not a question. Geneva nodded slowly. "Most likely. What are we going to do?" Geneva looked at the kitchen window, the clean white frame, the folding table still set up, still covered with its cloth, the handwritten menu taped neatly in place, waiting for customers who could no longer come. She looked at the window, and she looked at Keisha, and she looked at Zuri, whose small fist was curled around the collar of Keisha's shirt. And she made a decision that she did not yet have words for, but could feel settling into her bones like iron. "We are going to fight," Geneva said. The news spread through the neighborhood the way news always spreads in small communities, fast and loud and colored by emotion. By Wednesday, everyone on Maple Avenue knew that the health department had shut down Miss Geneva's kitchen window. And by Thursday, everyone knew who was responsible. Not because anyone had proof, but because Marcus Whitfield had made himself into the kind of man whose guilt was obvious even before the evidence arrived. He had talked badly about Geneva's food. He had smiled too wide. He had offered discounts at his restaurant on Saturdays, the same day Geneva served her plates. The math was not difficult. Mrs. Patterson was the first to show up at Geneva's door. She was a stout woman in her 60s with a voice that could carry across a football field and opinions that she shared freely and without invitation. She stood on Geneva's porch with her hands on her hips and her purse dangling from her elbow, looking like a general preparing for battle. Geneva Walker, I heard what that man did, and I want you to know that this community is not going to stand for it, she announced, loud enough for the entire block to hear. I have already called my cousin Denise, who works at the county office, and she is looking into this. I have also called Pastor Williams, who said he will mention it at Wednesday night Bible study. And I am personally boycotting that restaurant starting today. I have eaten there twice, and I want you to know the macaroni tastes like cardboard with cheese sauce from a can. Geneva could not help but smile, just a small one, barely a tug at the corner of her mouth. I appreciate that, Gloria. Appreciate nothing, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. You are family to this neighborhood. That man moved in 5 minutes ago and thinks he can push you out. He does not know who he is dealing with. Over the next few days, a quiet resistance took shape. The Johnson sisters organized a petition. Mr. Henderson spoke to the local newspaper, though no reporter called back. A group of young men from the barbershop on 3rd Street put up a hand-painted sign in their window. We stand with Miss Geneva. Keisha started a social media page called Save Miss Geneva's Kitchen and posted old photos of the food, of the line on Saturdays, of Geneva smiling through the window as she handed a plate to a child. The page got 200 followers in the first day, then 500. Then, after a local pastor shared it, over 1,000. Marcus Whitfield noticed. He noticed the sign in the barbershop window. He noticed the online chatter. He noticed that a few of his own customers were starting to ask questions. And Marcus Whitfield was not the kind of man who tolerated questions. He had built his empire by controlling the story, by being the loudest voice in the room, by making sure that anyone who opposed him understood the cost of opposition. He did not become a man with 23 restaurants by being gentle with people who got in his way. He called his lawyer on a Thursday afternoon. His name was Randall Price, a tall, thin man with steel-rimmed glasses and a reputation for winning cases not through brilliance, but through sheer, grinding, relentless pressure. Marcus sat in his office above the restaurant, a room with leather furniture and framed magazine covers on the walls, and explained the situation. An old woman selling food from her kitchen, a health department complaint, community backlash, social media noise. He wanted it handled. She has no permit and no license, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair and tapping his gold watch with one finger. The law is on our side. I want a court order. I want that window permanently shut. I want her cited, fined, whatever it takes. I want it clear to this neighborhood that I am not someone you go to war with over fried catfish. Randall Price adjusted his glasses and nodded. I can file for an injunction by Monday. If she's operating without a commercial kitchen permit, the county will support it. She won't have the resources to fight it. Good, Marcus said. He stood and walked to the window that overlooked the street. From his office, he could see Geneva's house directly across the way. The small porch, the peeling paint, the kitchen window with its handwritten menu still taped to the frame. He looked at it the way a man looks at a weed growing through his driveway. A nuisance, something to be ripped out and thrown away. But Marcus Whitfield did not know 3 things. He did not know that the woman across the street had a spine made of the same steel his watch was plated with. He did not know that the ground beneath his own restaurant had a story he had never bothered to learn. And he did not know that the past has a way of reaching up through the soil, grabbing you by the ankle, and pulling you down. The court hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the health department visit. Geneva received the notice on a Monday, delivered by a process server who rang the bell, handed her the envelope, and left without a word. She opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where she peeled potatoes and helped Amara with her math homework and listened to Dante read aloud from his library books. The legal language was dense and cold, full of words like injunction and respondent and violation of municipal code. The gist was clear enough. Marcus Whitfield, through his attorney, was asking the court to permanently prohibit Geneva from selling food from her residential property and to impose fines for past violations. Geneva read the notice twice and then folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of her dresser, next to her Bible, her daughter's death certificate, and a photograph of Cornelius Walker standing in front of the house the day he finished building it. She looked at that photograph for a long time. Cornelius was young in the picture, maybe 25, wearing his army uniform with the sleeves rolled up, grinning at the camera with a hammer in one hand and a nail in the other. He looked proud. He looked invincible. He looked like a man who had just staked his claim on a piece of the earth and dared the world to take it from him. Geneva touched the photograph with her fingertip, tracing the outline of the house behind Cornelius. The same house she was standing in now. The same walls, the same roof, the same kitchen where she had cooked 10,000 meals. Her father-in-law had built this house. Her husband Robert had grown up in it. She had raised Lorraine in it. And now she was raising Lorraine's children in it. This house was not just a building. It was a vessel that carried the Walker family through time. And she was not about to let a man with a gold watch and a franchise empire sink it. She needed a lawyer. She knew this. But lawyers cost money, and money was the one thing Geneva did not have. She mentioned this at church on Sunday, quietly, to Pastor Williams after the service, standing in the parking lot with her purse clutched to her chest and her grandchildren loading into Mrs. Patterson's car for the ride home. Pastor Williams listened with his hands clasped behind his back and his head bowed, the way he listened when something weighed on his spirit. "I know someone," he said after a pause, "a young woman. Her name is Diane Rhodes. She grew up in this neighborhood, went to law school on a scholarship, and she does pro bono work for the community. I baptized her when she was 11 years old." He placed a hand on Geneva's shoulder. "Let me make a call." Diane Rhodes came to Geneva's house the following evening. She was in her early 30s, with short natural hair and sharp brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple blouse and dark slacks, no jewelry except for small gold studs in her ears. She carried a leather briefcase that was scratched and worn from use, the briefcase of a lawyer who spent more time in courtrooms than in corner offices. She sat at Geneva's kitchen table and listened without interrupting as Geneva told her the entire story. The kitchen window, the catfish plates, the Saturday line, Marcus Whitfield, the health department, the cease and desist, the court notice. When Geneva finished, Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her briefcase and took out a yellow legal pad. "Mrs. Walker, I want to take your case, pro bono, no charge, but I need you to understand something." She leaned forward, her eyes serious. "Marcus Whitfield has money, connections, and a lawyer who gets paid by the hour to make your life difficult. We are going to fight him, but it will not be quick and it will not be painless. Are you prepared for that?" Geneva looked at Diane the way she looked at her grandchildren when they asked if dinner was ready, with patience, with warmth, and with absolute certainty. "Young lady, I have buried my husband, buried my daughter, and raised 5 children on catfish and prayer. I have been prepared my whole life." Diane smiled for the first time since she had walked through the door. It was a small smile, quick and sharp, like a blade being unsheathed. She picked up her pen. "Then let's get to work." The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Diane came to the house every evening after her regular job at the legal aid clinic, and she and Geneva sat at the kitchen table, going through paperwork, building their case. The first order of business was the health department complaint. Diane filed a public records request and discovered that the complaint had been filed anonymously through the county's online portal. The IP address traced back to a computer at Whitfield Dining Group's corporate office in Atlanta. This was not proof that Marcus himself had filed it, but it was close enough to smell. "He's arrogant," Diane said, tapping the printout with her pen. "Arrogant people make sloppy mistakes. We can use this." She also discovered something else. Geneva's Saturday kitchen operation, while technically in violation of the Commercial Kitchen Ordinance, fell under a cottage food exemption that the county had passed 2 years earlier. The exemption allowed home-based food sellers to operate without a full commercial kitchen permit, provided they sold directly to consumers and earned less than $50,000 per year. Geneva's annual Saturday income was roughly $12,000. She qualified easily. The health department inspector, Brian Teller, had either not known about the exemption or had deliberately ignored it. Diane filed a motion to dismiss the injunction based on the cottage food exemption. She also filed a counterclaim alleging that the health department complaint had been filed in bad faith by a commercial competitor seeking to eliminate a lawful home-based food operation. The countersuit named Whitfield Dining Group as the originator of the complaint and requested an investigation into whether the complaint constituted tortious interference with Geneva's business. When Marcus Whitfield received a copy of the countersuit, he was sitting in his office eating a steak from his own kitchen. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He read the filing twice, and a vein appeared on the side of his temple that his staff had learned to recognize as a warning sign. He called Randall Price immediately. "Who is this lawyer?" Marcus demanded, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Diane Rhodes. I've never heard of her." "She's a legal aid attorney," Randall said. "Young, hungry. She found the cottage food exemption and she's using it. She also traced the health complaint back to your office." Marcus set down his fork. The steak sat on the plate, slowly cooling, the juices pooling in the ceramic dish like something bleeding. "I don't care about a cottage food exemption. I own 23 restaurants. I am not going to be embarrassed by a woman who sells catfish out of a window. Make this go away." "Marcus," Randall said carefully, "the optics on this are not good. An old woman, 5 grandchildren, a dead daughter, the community behind her. If this gets attention, it becomes a story about a billionaire crushing a grandmother. That is not the story you want told." "Then tell a better one," Marcus snapped. "That's what I pay you for." But the story was already being told, and Marcus was losing control of it. Keisha's social media page had grown to over 5,000 followers. A local news station had picked up the story and run a short segment, 3 minutes of footage showing Geneva's house, the kitchen window, and a clip of Mrs. Patterson declaring, "That man is a bully and a coward, and this neighborhood will not be bullied." The segment ended with a shot of Whitfield's kitchen and a quote from Marcus's public relations team, calling the situation a routine health and safety matter. But the internet is not kind to men who call grandmothers a health and safety matter. The comments were brutal. The shares multiplied. Someone created a hashtag. Within a week, the story had spread beyond the neighborhood, beyond the city, beyond the state. A national food blog picked it up. A civil rights organization issued a statement. A celebrity chef in New York posted about it, calling Geneva the kind of cook America was built on, and Marcus Whitfield, everything wrong with corporate food culture. Marcus watched all of this from his office window, and the vein on his temple throbbed like a second heartbeat. Inside Geneva's house, the mood was something between exhaustion and quiet determination. Diane came every evening, and the kitchen table disappeared under a growing pile of legal documents, court filings, and research materials. Geneva cooked dinner around the paperwork, moving pots and pans with the ease of a woman who had long ago learned to make room for chaos in a small space. The children adapted the way children do. Amara started helping Diane organize files, carefully labeling folders with her neat handwriting. Dante and Deshawn made themselves useful by staying out of the way, playing in the backyard until dark. Zuri climbed into Geneva's lap every evening and fell asleep there, her small body warm and heavy against Geneva's chest, a reminder of what all of this was for. One evening, about a week before the court hearing, Diane arrived with a different energy. She was carrying a folder that she held close to her body, the way a person carries something fragile and important. She sat down at the table, moved aside a coloring book and a box of crayons, and opened the folder slowly. Inside were photocopies of old documents. Very old documents. The paper was yellowed even in the copies, and the handwriting was faded and formal, the kind of script people used in the 1940s. "Mrs. Walker," Diane said, and her voice had a quality to it that Geneva had not heard before. It was careful, almost reverent. "I need to ask you something. Do you know the full history of the land your house sits on?" Geneva frowned. "My father-in-law bought this land when he came back from the war, 1945. He built this house himself." "Yes," Diane said. "I know, but I'm not asking about your land. I'm asking about the land across the street." She pointed through the kitchen window toward the glowing sign of Whitfield's kitchen. "That lot, The one where Marcus Whitfield's restaurant stands right now. Do you know who owned that land originally? Geneva thought for a moment. Her brow creased. It's been empty as long as I can remember. Before that, I think there were some houses there, old houses. They got torn down years ago during some kind of development project. My husband Robert used to talk about it. He said the city took the land, cleared it, and then nothing ever got built. She paused. He said it wasn't right. He said the families who lived there got nothing. Diane nodded slowly. She pulled a document from the folder and slid it across the table. It was a property deed. Geneva looked at it, and the room seemed to tilt. The deed was dated March 12, 1945. It was signed by a man named William Jacobs, who had sold 2 parcels of land side by side on what was then called Maple Road. One parcel was listed as Lot 7. The other was listed as Lot 8. The buyer of both parcels was Cornelius James Walker. Geneva's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at the deed, and the kitchen seemed to fall away around her, the walls dissolving, the hum of the refrigerator fading, until there was nothing but the yellowed paper and the name of a man who had been dead for 30 years. Cornelius James Walker, her father-in-law. A man who had fought in a war, come home, and bought 2 pieces of land with every penny he had saved. Lot 7 is your house, Diane said gently. Lot 8 is the lot across the street. Your father-in-law owned both. Geneva's hand trembled as she reached for the document. She picked it up and held it close, as if the ink might disappear if she didn't guard it. But that lot has been empty for decades. The city took it. Robert always said the city took it. Diane pulled out another document. This one was a transfer of title, dated 1962. It showed Lot 8 being transferred from Cornelius Walker to the Glenwood Urban Development Authority. The reason listed was eminent domain, public use. The compensation listed was $200. $200 for a lot that, even in 1962, was worth at least $5,000. $200, Geneva whispered. The number hung in the air between them, small and obscene. It gets worse, Diane said. She placed the third document on the table. This was a signature page. It showed Cornelius Walker's signature authorizing the transfer of the land. But next to the signature was a note in Diane's handwriting. Signature does not match known exemplars. Comparing with military records and other Walker documents. Preliminary finding. Forged. The word landed in Geneva's chest like a stone dropped into still water. Forged. Someone had forged Cornelius Walker's signature. Someone had stolen his land with a stroke of a pen, and the man had never known, or if he had known, he had been powerless to stop it. And now, 60-some years later, a franchise restaurant sat on that stolen ground, and its owner was trying to destroy the granddaughter-in-law of the man he was robbing. Geneva set the document down. Her hands were shaking badly now, and she pressed them flat against the table to make them stop. She looked at Diane. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure about the deed," Diane said. "Your father-in-law owned Lot 8. The transfer was done under eminent domain, but the compensation was absurdly low, and the signature appears to be forged. The Glenwood Urban Development Authority was dissolved in 1978 after a corruption scandal. Several of its officials were indicted for fraud, including the falsification of property records to seize land from black families. Mrs. Walker, this was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern." "A pattern," Geneva repeated. "Yes, and here's what matters now." Diane leaned forward. The Urban Development Authority never developed the land. It sat empty for decades. Eventually, the city sold it at auction. The buyer was a development company called Glenwood Properties, LLC. Glenwood Properties, LLC later sold the lot to Whitfield Dining Group for the construction of a restaurant. She paused. But the original transfer was fraudulent. The signature was forged. That means the chain of title is broken, which means that Whitfield Dining Group does not legally own that land. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Even the refrigerator seemed to pause its humming. Geneva sat perfectly still, her hands flat on the table, her eyes fixed on the deed. Lot 8, Cornelius Walker's lot. The lot where Marcus Whitfield had built his empire's newest outpost, where he served food on white plates and charged $28 for a meal that Geneva could make for 3. The lot that had been stolen from a black veteran in 1962 with a forged signature and $200. "What are you saying?" Geneva asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Diane looked her dead in the eye. "I'm saying that the land Marcus Whitfield's restaurant sits on belongs to you. It has belonged to your family since 1945, and we can prove it." Geneva closed her eyes. She felt Zuri stir in her lap, the child murmuring in her sleep, dreaming whatever 6-year-olds dream about when the world around them is falling apart and coming together at the same time. She held the child tighter. She thought about Cornelius, a young man with a hammer and a dream. She thought about Robert, her husband, who had talked about the stolen land with bitterness in his voice, never knowing that the proof of the theft was buried in a county records office, waiting for someone stubborn enough to find it. She thought about Lorraine, who would have been so angry, so fiercely, beautifully angry. She opened her eyes. Then let's prove it. The days before the court hearing were among the most intense of Geneva's life, and she had lived through enough intense days to fill a book. Diane worked around the clock. She obtained certified copies of the original deed from the county recorder's office. She tracked down military records showing Cornelius Walker's genuine signature and had a handwriting expert prepare a preliminary analysis comparing it to the signature on the 1962 transfer. The expert's conclusion was unequivocal. The signatures did not match. The transfer had been forged. Diane also dug into the history of the Glenwood Urban Development Authority. She found court records from the 1978 corruption trial, in which 3 officials had been convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and forgery related to the seizure of property from minority homeowners. The scheme had been systematic. Officials identified land owned by black families, fabricated transfer documents, seized the properties for pennies, and either sold them to developers or left them vacant. Dozens of families had been affected. Cornelius Walker was one of them. The implications were enormous. If the original transfer was fraudulent, then every subsequent sale of Lot 8 was void. The city could not sell land it did not legally own. Glenwood Properties LLC could not sell what it had not legally bought. And Whitfield Dining Group could not own what had never been legally sold. The chain was broken at its first link, and every link after it crumbled. Geneva did not sleep well during those days. She lay in bed in the dark, listening to Zuri breathe, and stared at the ceiling with eyes that burned from tiredness but would not close. She thought about what Diane had told her, and the weight of it pressed against her chest like a stone. This was not just about catfish and a kitchen window anymore. This was about land, about history, about a family that had been stolen from, quietly and systematically, by people who believed that a black man's signature on a deed was just ink to be copied and discarded. She got up one night at 2 in the morning and went to the living room. She sat in the old armchair by the window, the one Robert had loved, and looked at the photograph on the mantel. Robert and Lorraine, taken at Lorraine's high school graduation. Robert in the suit he had borrowed from his brother. Lorraine in her cap and gown, grinning like the whole world was a gift she was about to unwrap. They were both gone now, both of them, buried in the same cemetery on the hill east of town, under the oaks, where the ground was soft and the light came through the leaves in the afternoon like gold coins falling from heaven. "I'm going to fix this," Geneva whispered to the photograph. "I don't know exactly how, but I'm going to fix this. For you, for Papa Cornelius, for the children, for everybody who ever lost something they shouldn't have lost." The photograph did not answer, of course, but Geneva felt something shift in the dark room, something warm and steady, like a hand placed on her shoulder by someone she could not see. She sat there for a long time, and when she finally went back to bed, she slept. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a gray sky and a cold wind that rattled the windows of the house on Maple Avenue. Geneva dressed in her best outfit, a navy blue dress she had worn to Lorraine's funeral and had not put on since. She smoothed the fabric over her hips and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked old. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had been carrying a weight that would have broken most people years ago. But her eyes were clear, and her jaw was set. And when she straightened her shoulders, she saw something in the mirror that reminded her of Cornelius in that old photograph. Something unbreakable. Keisha helped the younger children get ready. Amara wore a dress she had outgrown slightly, the sleeves a touch too short. Dante and Deshawn wore matching button-down shirts that Mrs. Patterson had brought over the day before, still in the packaging, tags still attached. Zuri wore a yellow dress with white flowers that Lorraine had bought for her before she got sick, one of the last things Lorraine had picked out herself. Geneva buttoned it carefully, her fingers trembling just slightly, and kissed Zuri's forehead. They walked to the courthouse together, the whole family walking down Maple Avenue in the gray morning light. And they were not alone. Mrs. Patterson was waiting on her porch, and she fell into step beside Geneva without a word. Mr. Henderson was at the corner, leaning on his cane, and he joined them. The Johnson sisters came out of their apartment building. The barber from 3rd Street closed his shop early. By the time they reached the end of the block, there were 20 people walking with Geneva. By the time they reached the courthouse, there were 50. The courtroom was on the 2nd floor, a large room with wooden benches and fluorescent lights and a faint smell of floor polish and old coffee. Geneva sat at the respondents' table with Diane beside her. Keisha sat in the front row of the gallery with her siblings, holding Zuri on her lap. Behind them, the benches filled with neighbors, church members, strangers who had seen the story online and driven from other towns to be there. Mrs. Patterson sat directly behind Geneva and periodically leaned forward to squeeze her shoulder. Marcus Whitfield arrived 10 minutes late, flanked by Randall Price and the young associate carrying 2 rolling briefcases full of documents. Marcus wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him like it had been painted on. His gold watch caught the fluorescent light. He walked to the petitioner's table with the easy stride of a man who was accustomed to walking into rooms and owning them. He did not look at Geneva. He did not look at the gallery full of people staring at him. He sat down, unbuttoned his jacket, and leaned back in his chair. The judge was a woman named Honorable Patricia Chen. She was in her 50s, with reading glasses perched on her nose, and an expression that suggested she had seen every variety of human behavior and was no longer surprised by any of it. She called the case, read the docket number, and asked Randall Price to present the petitioner's argument. Randall stood and spoke for 12 minutes. He was smooth and practiced, laying out the case with the precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Geneva Walker had been selling food from a residential kitchen without a permit. The county health code was clear. The cease and desist order was valid. Whitfield Dining Group was seeking a permanent injunction to prevent future violations, along with fines for past infractions. It was a simple case, a matter of public safety. When he sat down, Marcus Whitfield nodded, just barely, a small tilt of his chin that said, "That's that." Then Diane stood. She was half the age of Randall Price and owned approximately 1% of his wardrobe budget. But when she spoke, the room went still. Her voice was calm and clear, with an edge beneath the surface, like a river with rocks underneath. "Your Honor, my client Geneva Walker is a 73-year-old grandmother raising 5 orphan grandchildren on her own. She has been feeding her neighbors from her kitchen window every Saturday for 7 years. She is not a health hazard, she is a lifeline." Diane paused. The health department complaint that triggered this action was filed anonymously from a computer at Whitfield Dining Group's corporate office. The cottage food exemption, County Ordinance 14-215, enacted 2 years ago, explicitly permits home-based food sales of the kind Mrs. Walker conducts. The health inspector who issued the cease and desist either did not know about this exemption or chose to ignore it. The petitioner's injunction has no legal basis. Randall Price was already on his feet. "Your Honor, the cottage food exemption has specific requirements regarding labeling and annual sales caps that the respondent has not demonstrated compliance with." Diane did not flinch. "We are prepared to demonstrate full compliance, Your Honor. Mrs. Walker's annual food sales total approximately $12,000, well below the $50,000 cap. She sells directly to individual consumers, not through retail or wholesale channels. She meets every requirement of the exemption. Judge Chen looked over her glasses at both attorneys. Ms. Rhodes, is there anything else you wish to present? Diane took a slow breath. This was the moment. Geneva could see it in the way Diane's fingers tightened around the edge of the folder she was holding, the way she stood a little straighter, the way her eyes sharpened. This was the moment everything had been leading to. Yes, Your Honor. I wish to present a counterclaim on behalf of my client regarding the property on which the petitioner's restaurant currently operates. Diane opened the folder and removed the documents, handling them with the care of a person holding something sacred. I have here a certified copy of a property deed dated March 12, 1945, recorded in the Glenwood County Recorder's Office, Volume 47, page 312. This deed shows the sale of 2 parcels of land on Maple Road, designated as Lot 7 and Lot 8, to Cornelius James Walker, the respondent's father-in-law. The room was silent. Absolutely silent. Geneva could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing above her head, a thin electric whine that seemed to grow louder in the quiet. Lot 7 is the parcel on which Mrs. Walker's home currently sits, Diane continued. Lot 8 is the parcel directly across the street, the parcel on which Whitfield's kitchen now stands. Marcus Whitfield's head turned. Slowly, like a man hearing a sound he cannot identify. His eyes moved from Diane to the folder in her hand to Geneva, who sat perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight as a church pew. Diane placed the deed on the judge's bench. In 1962, Lot 8 was transferred from Cornelius Walker to the Glenwood Urban Development Authority under a claim of eminent domain. The compensation paid was $200, far below the market value. The transfer document bears a signature purported to be that of Cornelius Walker. She placed a second document beside the first. I have here a preliminary analysis by a certified forensic handwriting expert comparing the signature on the transfer document with known exemplars of Cornelius Walker's signature from military records and other legal documents. The expert's conclusion is that the signature on the transfer is not genuine. It was forged. A murmur ran through the gallery. It started at the back and rippled forward, a wave of whispers and gasps and sharp intakes of breath. Mrs. Patterson's hand gripped the back of Geneva's chair so hard the wood creaked. Marcus Whitfield sat very still. The gold watch on his wrist caught the light, but he did not move his hand. He did not move anything. His face had gone perfectly blank, the expression of a man whose internal systems had just received information that did not fit into any existing category and were struggling to process it. Randall Price leaned over and whispered something in Marcus's ear. Marcus did not respond. His eyes were fixed on the deed, lying on the judge's bench like a grenade with the pin pulled. Diane was not finished. Your Honor, the Glenwood Urban Development Authority was dissolved in 1978 following a federal corruption investigation. 3 of its officials were convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and forgery related to the systematic seizure of property from black homeowners. Court records from that trial document a pattern of forged signatures, fraudulent transfer documents, and below-market compensation designed to dispossess minority families of their land. She placed a thick folder of supporting documents on the bench. Cornelius Walker's property was seized as part of this scheme. The transfer was fraudulent. The land was never legally sold. Objection, Randall Price said, standing abruptly. His voice was steady, but there was a tightness around his mouth, the look of a man who had just stepped on something unexpected. Your Honor, this is a hearing on a health code injunction, not a property dispute. The respondent's attorney is introducing an entirely separate matter that has not been properly filed or briefed. Judge Chen looked at Randall Price for a long moment. Then she looked at Diane. Then she looked at the documents on her bench. She removed her reading glasses, cleaned them with a small cloth, and put them back on. Mr. Price, she said, the petitioner brought this action seeking to permanently enjoin the respondent from operating a food business on her property. The respondent has raised a counterclaim regarding the ownership of the petitioner's property. I will hear it. Randall sat down. Marcus leaned over and whispered again, more urgently this time. Randall shook his head, a small, tight movement. Marcus's jaw clenched. The muscle along his jawline twitched twice, a rapid, involuntary pulse that he could not control. Diane continued. The chain of title for Lot 8 proceeds as follows. In 1962, the lot was fraudulently transferred to the Glenwood Urban Development Authority. In 1979, following the dissolution of the authority, the lot was transferred to Glenwood County. In 1998, the county sold the lot at public auction to a development company called Glenwood Properties, LLC. In 2023, Glenwood Properties, LLC sold the lot to Whitfield Dining Group for the purpose of constructing a restaurant. She paused and looked directly at Marcus. But a fraudulent transfer does not convey legal title. A buyer cannot acquire rights that the seller did not legally possess. Every sale of Lot 8 after 1962 is void because the original transfer was void. The land never left the Walker family. Whitfield Dining Group does not own that lot. It has never owned that lot. The murmur in the gallery became a roar. People were talking, exclaiming, some standing up to get a better view. Judge Chen tapped her gavel twice, sharply, and the room quieted, but the energy in it had changed. It was electric, charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Marcus Whitfield stood up. He did not ask permission. He did not look at his lawyer. He stood up and pointed a finger at Geneva Walker, and his voice came out in a hoarse, ragged bark that did not sound like the smooth, confident businessman the magazines had profiled. "This is ridiculous," he said. "I bought that land legally. I have the purchase agreement. I have the title insurance. I paid $2.3 million for that property, and I am not going to sit here and listen to some fairy tale about a dead man and a stolen deed." "Mr. Whitfield," Judge Chen said, her voice as cold and flat as a sheet of ice, "you will sit down and address this court through your attorney, or I will hold you in contempt." Marcus did not sit down immediately. He stood there, finger still pointing, chest heaving, and in that moment, Geneva saw something she had seen before, many times, in many different faces over the years. She saw a powerful man confronting the possibility that his power was an illusion. She saw the terror of a person who had built their entire life on a foundation they had never bothered to inspect, and the foundation was crumbling. Randall Price placed a hand on Marcus's arm and pulled him back into his chair. Marcus sat down hard, and the chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a yelp. His face was dark with anger, and his hands were balled into fists on the table, the knuckles tight and white beneath his skin. The gold watch gleamed on his wrist, but it looked different now. It looked like what it was. Just a watch. Just metal and glass on the arm of a man who was beginning to understand that he was in serious trouble. Judge Chen spent several minutes reviewing the documents. The courtroom waited in a silence so thick that Geneva could hear Mr. Henderson's cane tapping nervously against the floor 3 rows back. Keisha was holding Zuri so tight the little girl squirmed and let out a small whimper. Amara sat perfectly still, her eyes wide, her hands clasped in her lap. Dante and Deshawn looked at each other with expressions that were half scared and half thrilled, the way children look when they sense that something enormous is happening, but do not fully understand what. Finally, Judge Chen looked up. "Ms. Rhodes, the documents you have presented raise significant questions about the chain of title for the property in question. This court is not equipped to resolve a property dispute of this magnitude in the context of a health code hearing. However, I am taking the following actions." She paused, and the room leaned forward. "First, the petitioner's request for a permanent injunction against Mrs. Walker is denied. The respondent's food sales operation falls within the cottage food exemption under County Ordinance 14-215. The cease and desist order issued by the Health Department is hereby vacated." A sound went through the gallery. Not a cheer, not yet, but a collective exhale. A release of breath held too long. "Second, I am referring the property ownership matter to the Civil Division for a full evidentiary hearing. Ms. Rhodes, I expect you to file a formal complaint within 30 days. Mr. Price, I expect your client to respond. In the meantime, I am issuing a temporary restraining order preventing any alteration, sale, or encumbrance of the property known as Lot 8, pending resolution of the ownership dispute. Marcus Whitfield's head dropped forward. Just an inch, just a small dip, but Geneva saw it. She saw the weight land on him, saw his shoulders draw together, saw his hands unclench and go limp on the table. The man who had walked into this courtroom like he owned it now sat in his chair like a man who had just been told that the ground beneath his feet did not belong to him. "Third," Judge Chen said, and now her voice had a quality that was not quite anger, but something close, a controlled heat that warmed her words like coals. "I am ordering the county health department to review the circumstances under which the complaint against Mrs. Walker was filed. The apparent filing of a bad faith complaint by a commercial competitor to weaponize a government agency against a lawful home-based food business is a matter I take very seriously. If the investigation reveals misconduct, I will refer it to the district attorney." Randall Price stood again. "Your Honor, my client had no direct involvement in the filing of the health department complaint." Judge Chen looked at him over her glasses. "Then your client has nothing to worry about." The gavel came down. The hearing was over. And in the second-floor courtroom of the Glenwood County Courthouse, under buzzing fluorescent lights and the gaze of 50 witnesses, the story of Marcus Whitfield and Geneva Walker entered a new chapter. What happened next came in waves, each one larger than the last. The first wave was the news. Diane had texted a summary of the hearing to the reporter who had covered the original story, and by that evening it was on the local news. By the next morning it was on 3 national outlets. By the end of the week, the story of the grandmother, the catfish, the stolen land, and the billionaire franchise owner had gone viral in a way that none of them, not Geneva, not Diane, not even Marcus Whitfield, had anticipated. The headline that circulated the most was simple and devastating. Franchise owner tried to shut down grandmother's kitchen. Her family owns the land under his restaurant. It was shared hundreds of thousands of times. It appeared on morning talk shows. It was discussed in podcasts and argued about in comment sections. People who had never heard of Geneva Walker or Marcus Whitfield or Glenwood Park formed opinions and took sides and sent emails and posted declarations of support or outrage, depending on which side of the story resonated with their own experiences. For Geneva, the attention was overwhelming. She was not a public person. She was a private woman who made catfish and raised children and went to church. She did not want to be on television. She did not want strangers calling her house. She did not want to be a symbol. But the world had decided that she was one, and there was no putting that particular genie back in the bottle. Keisha managed the social media page, which had exploded to over 50,000 followers. She screened the calls and messages, filtering out the cranks and the scammers and the people who wanted to exploit the situation, and passing through the genuine offers of support. A legal defense fund had been set up by one of the national organizations, and donations poured in. $15,000, then $50,000. Then, after a tech entrepreneur in California shared the story with his 3 million followers, over $200,000. Geneva sat at the kitchen table and looked at the number on Diane's phone. $200,000. More money than she had earned in the last 10 years combined. More money than she had ever seen in one place in her entire life. She did not know what to do with the number. It was too large to fit inside her understanding. She looked at it and looked at Diane and said, "Is this real?" "It's real," Diane said, smiling, "and it's going to pay for the best property lawyer in the state." Marcus Whitfield, meanwhile, was enduring a different kind of wave, his own. The news coverage was brutal. His public relations team issued statements, but the statements sounded hollow and corporate in the face of a story that had all the elements of a modern parable. Rich man versus poor grandmother. Stolen land. Forged documents. 5 orphan children. The narrative was too powerful to counter with press releases. His Yelp reviews tanked. His social media was flooded with angry comments. 3 franchise locations in other cities reported a significant drop in business. He sat in his office above the restaurant and stared at the wall. The framed magazine covers that had once filled him with pride now looked like artifacts from a life that was dissolving. He had worked hard for what he had. He had clawed his way up from nothing, from a childhood of poverty and instability, and he had built something real. Something tangible. 23 restaurants, a brand, a legacy. And now, because of an old woman and a yellowed piece of paper, it was all in danger. He called his mother. He had not called her in 3 months, and when she answered, her voice was cool and distant, the voice of a woman who had long ago accepted that her son's success had taken him to a place she could not follow.
"Marcus," she said, "I saw the news."
"Mama, I didn't steal anyone's land. I bought it fair and square. I had no way of knowing about some forged deed from 1962.
There was a pause on the other end of the line. A long, heavy pause that Marcus felt in his stomach.
"Did you file that complaint against the old woman?" his mother asked. Marcus opened his mouth and closed it. He rubbed his forehead with his free hand. The gold watch slid down his wrist. "It was a health and safety issue, Mama. She was selling food without a permit. I was within my rights." "I didn't ask about your rights, Marcus. I asked if you filed the complaint to shut down an old woman's kitchen so your restaurant could make more money. Did you do that?"
Another pause. This one was his.
"Yes," he said. His mother was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was not angry. It was something worse. It was sad. "Your grandmother used to sell plates of food from the front porch of her house in Mississippi. Did you know that? Sweet potato pie, fried chicken, cornbread. She fed the whole street for $2 a plate. It's how she put your daddy through school." She paused. "You tried to destroy a woman who was doing the same thing your grandmother did, for the same reasons, to feed her family. And you wonder why I don't recognize you anymore." Marcus hung up the phone. He sat in his leather chair and looked at the gold watch on his wrist and the leather furniture in his office and the framed covers on his wall. And for the first time in a very long time, he did not see success. He saw camouflage. He saw a costume he had put on to hide the boy from Mississippi who had been hungry and scared. And somewhere along the way, the costume had become the man. And the man had become someone who would crush an old woman to protect a sign. The weeks that followed were consumed by the property case. Diane retained a senior property attorney named Harriet Monroe, a formidable woman in her 60s who had spent her career litigating land disputes, particularly those involving historical injustices against black families. Harriet was tall, silver-haired, and spoke in measured sentences that landed like verdicts. She reviewed Diane's research, confirmed the validity of the 1945 deed, and filed a formal quiet title action against Whitfield Dining Group, Glenwood Properties, LLC, and Glenwood County. The case drew attention from legal scholars, historians, and civil rights organizations. A history professor at the State University published a paper documenting the Glenwood Urban Development Authority's systematic theft of black-owned land during the 1950s and 1960s, identifying over 40 families whose properties had been seized through fraudulent means. Cornelius Walker was one of them. The professor's research confirmed what Diane had found and provided additional context that strengthened the case. Marcus's legal team, now expanded to include 2 additional attorneys from a prestigious firm in Atlanta, mounted a defense based on the doctrine of bona fide purchaser. They argued that even if the original 1962 transfer was fraudulent, Marcus had purchased the land in good faith, without knowledge of the fraud, and that the passage of time and multiple intervening sales should protect his ownership. It was a reasonable argument. It was the kind of argument that had worked in courtrooms for decades, the kind of argument that had allowed stolen land to stay stolen, generation after generation, because the law had been designed to protect the most recent buyer, not the original owner. But Harriet Monroe had seen this argument before, and she had come prepared. She presented evidence showing that the Glenwood Urban Development Authority's corruption had been a matter of public record since the 1978 trial. She argued that any purchaser of land originally held by the authority had constructive notice of the fraud. She cited precedents from other states where courts had ruled that stolen property could not be laundered through multiple sales, that the original owner's rights persisted regardless of how many times the property changed hands. The case moved slowly through the system, as legal cases do. There were motions and counter-motions, depositions and discovery requests, hearings, and continuances. Geneva attended every one. She sat in the courtroom with her navy blue dress and her clear eyes and her straight back, and she watched the lawyers argue about her family's land with the patience of a woman who had learned that justice was not fast, but if you were stubborn enough, it was possible. During this time, something remarkable happened at home. The Saturday kitchen window reopened. With the cease and desist order vacated, Geneva was legally free to resume her cottage food operation. And resume it she did. The first Saturday back, she woke at 4:30 as always and began her preparations. Catfish, greens, cornbread, mac and cheese, sweet potato pie, lemonade. The same menu, the same love. But when she opened the window at 10 o'clock, the line was not 10 people. It was not 15. It was 100. People had come from all over the city, from neighboring towns, from places Geneva had never heard of. They stood on the sidewalk in a line that stretched around the block, holding their phones, wearing T-shirts that said, "I stand with Miss Geneva," and "Feed the people." Mrs. Patterson was at the front of the line, of course, wearing a new hat and a triumphant smile. Mr. Henderson was right behind her, leaning on his cane and telling anyone who would listen that he had been Geneva's first customer and always would be. Geneva stood at her window and looked out at the line, and her eyes filled with tears. She wiped them with the back of her hand and took a deep breath and picked up her serving spoon and said, "All right, who's first?" And Mr. Henderson stepped up and said, "Morning, Miss Geneva. I hope you made extra greens today because I am starving and I am not sharing." And Geneva smiled and handed him a plate piled high, and he pressed a $20 bill into her hand and told her to keep the change. She sold out of food by noon. She made more. She sold out again by 2. Keisha ran to the store for more supplies, and Geneva cooked until the stove was too hot to touch, and her arms ached from stirring and her feet throbbed from standing. She made $700 that day, then $800 the next Saturday, then over $1,000. The kitchen window had become more than a local secret. It had become a destination. Marcus Whitfield watched from across the street. His own restaurant had not been empty, exactly, but it was no longer full either. The tables that had been packed on opening night now had gaps. The lunch rush was thinner. The dinner crowd was smaller. People were choosing sides, and the side with the 73-year-old grandmother and the catfish plates was winning. He stood at his office window and watched the line at Geneva's house, and something shifted in his face. It was subtle, barely visible, but it was there. The hard set of his jaw softened, just a fraction. The tight lines around his eyes eased. He watched the old woman hand a plate to a child, watched the child's face light up, watched the mother mouth "thank you" through the window. And for a brief, flickering moment, he remembered something he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten it existed. He remembered being 7 years old, standing on his grandmother's porch in Mississippi, holding a paper plate loaded with sweet potato pie, feeling full and safe and loved. He remembered the smell of his grandmother's kitchen. He remembered her hands, rough and warm, pressing the plate into his grip. He remembered her voice. "Eat, baby, there's plenty." The memory came and went, quick as a match flare, and Marcus turned away from the window. He sat down at his desk and poured himself a glass of water from the crystal pitcher his designer had chosen. The water was cold and clean and tasteless. He drank it and set the glass down and stared at his hands, and for the first time, he did not see a self-made man. He saw a man who had made himself into something his grandmother would not have recognized. 6 months after the original court hearing, the property case went to trial. It was held in the same courtroom before Judge Patricia Chen, who had requested it. The trial lasted 3 days. Harriet Monroe presented the 1945 deed, the forensic handwriting analysis, the records from the 1978 corruption trial, the chain of title showing every fraudulent sale, and the testimony of the history professor who had documented the scheme. She called Geneva to the stand, and Geneva told the story of Cornelius Walker in a voice that was steady and clear. The voice of a woman who was no longer telling her own story, but the story of a family, a community,
a history that had been silenced for too long. Diane sat in the gallery and watched Geneva testify, and she thought about the first evening she had sat at that kitchen table with the yellow legal pad and the worn briefcase, and she felt a pride so fierce it almost hurt. This was why she had gone to law school. This was why she had come back to the neighborhood. This was why she did the work. Marcus Whitfield's attorneys presented their case. They argued good faith. They argued the passage of time. They argued that overturning Marcus's ownership would create chaos in the real estate market, that no buyer could ever feel secure if a 60-year-old fraud could void their title. It was a strong argument, technically, but in a courtroom full of people who had lived the consequences of that fraud, it fell flat. Marcus himself did not testify. His attorneys had advised against it, knowing that his temper was a liability. He sat at the petitioner's table for 3 days, wearing his charcoal suit and his gold watch, and he said nothing. But on the second day of the trial, something happened that no one had expected. A woman appeared in the gallery. She was in her 80s, small and frail, with white hair and a cane, and a floral dress that smelled faintly of lavender. She sat down in the back row and waited, and when Harriet Monroe called her to the stand, a ripple of surprise went through the courtroom. Her name was Cecilia Boone. She was 91 years old, and she was the last surviving member of the families whose land had been stolen by the Glenwood Urban Development Authority. She had known Cornelius Walker. She had lived 3 houses down from him on Maple Road. She remembered the day the men from the authority came to her own door with papers she did not understand and demands she could not refuse. She had lost her home. Her husband had died 2 years later, and she had always believed that the stress and the humiliation and the injustice had contributed to his death. She had spent 60 years waiting for someone to care. Cecilia Boone sat in the witness chair and looked at Geneva, and Geneva looked back at her. And between them passed a current of recognition and grief and solidarity that was older than both of them. Mrs. Boone's testimony was devastating. She spoke in a clear, thin voice that never wavered, describing the tactics of the authority, the forged signatures, the threats, the way families were told to take the money and be grateful. She identified 3 officials by name. She described documents she had signed under duress, and she looked at the judge and said, with a simplicity that cut through every legal argument like a blade, "They stole our land, Your Honor. They stole it, and nobody ever gave it back. And that man over there built his restaurant on stolen ground." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Marcus Whitfield stared at the old woman, and for the first time since the hearing began, he looked something other than angry. He looked shaken. He looked like a man who was seeing his own story reflected in a mirror he could not look away from. A boy from Mississippi. A grandmother who sold food from her porch. A family that had nothing and built something from it. And here he was, on the other side of the same story, the one doing the taking instead of the one being taken from. The irony was not lost on him. Geneva could see it in his face. She could see it breaking something behind his eyes, some wall he had built to keep the boy from Mississippi separate from the man in the charcoal suit. Judge Chen deliberated for 4 days. On a Friday afternoon, she issued her ruling. The courtroom was packed. Geneva sat at her table with Diane on one side and Harriet Monroe on the other. Keisha was behind her, holding Zuri, who was asleep. Mrs. Patterson sat to Keisha's right, her hat at a perfect angle, her jaw set. The ruling was thorough and detailed, running over 40 pages. But the core finding was clear. The 1962 transfer of Lot 8 from Cornelius Walker to the Glenwood Urban Development Authority was void due to fraud. The signature had been forged. The compensation had been grossly inadequate. The transfer had been part of a documented pattern of criminal activity targeting minority homeowners. Every subsequent sale of Lot 8 was therefore void. The land belonged to the estate of Cornelius James Walker and, by extension, to his surviving heir, Geneva Walker. Judge Chen ordered Whitfield Dining Group to vacate the property within 90 days. She ordered the county to initiate proceedings to identify and compensate all families affected by the authority's fraud. and she referred the matter to the state attorney general for a comprehensive investigation into the remaining properties seized by the authority. Marcus Whitfield sat in his chair and listened to the ruling and did not move. His attorney whispered to him something about an appeal, about grounds, about options. But Marcus was not listening. He was looking at Geneva, who sat across the aisle with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed, her lips moving silently. She was praying. And Marcus, who had not prayed in 20 years, felt something in his chest crack. Not break, but crack. The way a frozen lake cracks in the spring when the ice begins to thaw from underneath. The courtroom erupted. People stood and cheered and cried and hugged each other. Mrs. Patterson threw her hat in the air. Mr. Henderson pounded his cane on the floor. The Johnson sisters held hands and wept. Keisha buried her face in Zuri's hair and sobbed. The kind of sobbing that comes from a place too deep for words. The place where a 16-year-old girl keeps all the grief and fear and hope that she has carried since her mother died and her world fell apart and her grandmother picked up the pieces one by one and put them back together with nothing but love and catfish and an unbreakable will. Geneva opened her eyes. She looked at the judge. She looked at Diane, who was crying freely, making no effort to wipe her face. She looked at Keisha and the children. She looked at the gallery full of people who had walked with her to this courtroom months ago and had come back today to see the end of the story. And then she looked at Marcus Whitfield, sitting alone at his table while his attorneys packed their briefcases and avoided eye contact. She stood up. Diane reached for her arm, but Geneva shook her head gently and walked across the aisle. She stood in front of Marcus's table and looked down at him. And Marcus looked up at her, and the distance between them was 3 feet, but also 100 years. The span of a history that connected them in ways neither of them had understood until this moment.
Mr. Whitfield, Geneva said. Her voice was quiet, not angry, not triumphant, quiet. The voice of a woman who had won something and understood the weight of it. My father-in-law built his house with his own hands. He built it because he believed that if a man owned his own land, nobody could ever take his dignity. Somebody took his land. Somebody took his dignity. And now, I've got it back. She paused. Marcus said nothing. His jaw was clenched, but his eyes were wet. I am not going to gloat, Geneva said. That is not who I am. But I want you to understand something. I did not come to this courtroom to take your restaurant. I came here because you tried to take my kitchen window. You tried to take the only thing that keeps my grandchildren fed. And you did it because you could. Because you had the money and the power and the connections. And I had nothing but a frying pan and a prayer. She looked at him steadily. The prayer won. She turned and walked back to her table. Marcus watched her go. His hand moved unconsciously to his wrist, where the gold watch sat heavy against his skin. He pressed the clasp and removed it. He set it on the table in front of him and stared at it for a long moment. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. The months that followed were a season of change, deep and quiet and real, like the turning of soil after a long winter. Geneva did not tear down Marcus Whitfield's restaurant. She did not demand that he leave immediately, although the court had given her every right to do so. Instead, she sat with Diane and Harriet and talked about what she wanted, truly wanted, not what the world expected her to want. What she wanted was simple. She wanted the children to be safe. She wanted the neighborhood to thrive. She wanted Cornelius Walker's name to mean something again. She agreed to a settlement with Whitfield Dining Group. Marcus would pay fair market rent for the property for a period of 2 years, during which time he could continue to operate the restaurant while relocating to a new site. The rent would go into a trust fund for the 5 children. After 2 years, the property would revert fully to Geneva. Marcus agreed without negotiation. His lawyers had told him to fight, to appeal, to delay. He told them no. He told them he was tired of fighting the wrong people. The settlement money, combined with the donations from the Legal Defense Fund, transformed the family's circumstances. Keisha received a full scholarship to a university in the state capital, the first Walker to attend college. Amara enrolled in a magnet school for the arts.
Dante and Deshawn got new bicycles and new shoes, and for the first time in their lives, the feeling of not being the poorest kids in the room. Zuri got a new bed, a real bed, with a princess canopy and sheets that matched, and a nightlight shaped like a star. She slept through the night for the first time in months. Geneva used some of the money to renovate the kitchen. Not a commercial renovation, nothing fancy. She replaced the cracked linoleum with new tile. She bought a new stove with 4 working burners. She got a proper ventilation hood and a second sink. She had the kitchen window reframed and fitted with a proper counter that folded out, sturdy enough to hold 10 plates at once. She kept the handwritten menu. Some things did not need to be upgraded. The first Saturday after the renovation, she woke at 4:30. She lay in bed for a moment, listening. Zuri's breathing was slow and steady in the new bed across the room. Down the hall, she could hear Keisha's alarm go off, the soft beep, beep, beep of a girl who had learned to wake early because her grandmother needed help. Geneva smiled in the darkness and swung her legs over the side of the bed and put her feet on the floor and stood up. Her knees ached. Her back carried its dull fire, but she was standing. She was alive. She was here. The catfish was perfect that day. She knew it the way a musician knows when a note is right, when the sound resonates in the chest and the air vibrates with something true. She seasoned each fillet with her blend, the blend with the secret ingredient she had never told anyone about. She dredged them in cornmeal. She fried them until the crust was golden and the flesh inside was white and flaking and tender. She made her greens slow and rich. She made her cornbread from her mother's recipe. She made her mac and cheese with 3 cheeses and a crust of buttered breadcrumbs. She made sweet potato pie, whipping the filling by hand, because she still did not own an electric mixer and had decided she never wanted one. At 10 o'clock, she opened the window. The line stretched down the block. She saw familiar faces and new ones, old customers and young families and people who had driven from far away just to taste the food they had heard about. Mrs. Patterson was first, of course. She wore a new hat, green with a white feather, and she looked magnificent. Behind her was Mr. Henderson, leaning on his cane, wearing the same brown fedora he had worn since 1987. "Morning, Miss Geneva," he said. "I hope you made extra greens today because I am starving and I am not sharing." Geneva laughed, a real laugh, deep and warm and free, the kind of laugh she had not laughed in a long time. She handed him a plate piled high. He pressed a $50 bill into her hand. "Keep the change," he said, tipping his hat. Geneva looked at the $50 bill and then at Mr. Henderson, and then at the line of people stretching down Maple Avenue. And she thought about Cornelius Walker standing in front of this house in 1945 with a hammer in his hand, building a future he would never fully see. She thought about Robert, who had known the land was stolen but had never been able to prove it. She thought about Lorraine, who would have been so proud. She thought about Keisha and Amara and Dante and Deshawn and little Zuri, who were her future and her reason and her everything. She thought about Marcus Whitfield, who had called her last week. He had not said much. He had called and said, "Mrs. Walker, I owe you an apology, and I don't know how to give it. I just know I owe it." Geneva had listened and said, "Then start with your grandmother's recipe, sweet potato pie. Make it yourself. See if you remember how." Marcus had been quiet for a long time, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick. "Yes, ma'am," he had said. "I'll try." She tucked the $50 bill into her apron pocket and picked up her serving spoon and looked out through the kitchen window at the morning light falling on Maple Avenue, on the house her father-in-law had built, on the land that had been stolen and returned, on the neighborhood that had stood by her when standing was the only thing left to do. The window frame was freshly painted, clean and white. The same window, but new. The same Geneva, but stronger. The same story, but with an ending that Cornelius Walker would have finally been proud of. She served the next customer, and the next, and the next. The line moved slowly, the way good things always move, patient and steady, one plate at a time. The smell of fried catfish drifted through the kitchen window and out into the morning air. down the sidewalk, across the street, past the restaurant that would soon have a new name and a new purpose, and up into the sky where it mixed with the breeze and disappeared, carrying with it the invisible, unmistakable scent of a woman who had refused to be erased. Geneva wiped her hands on her apron. The cotton was soft against her palms, worn thin from years of use, familiar as her own skin. She looked at the next person in line, a young woman holding a baby on her hip, and she smiled.
What can I get you, sweetheart?
The young woman looked at the menu taped to the window frame, handwritten in Geneva's careful script, and said, "Everything. I want to try everything." Geneva nodded. She loaded the plate. Catfish, greens, cornbread, mac and cheese. She added an extra piece of cornbread because the baby was reaching for it with tiny fingers, and because giving a little extra had always been Geneva's way of saying what words could never fully say. She handed the plate through the window. The young woman took it and looked at the food, and then at Geneva, and her eyes glistened. "Thank you," she said. "My grandmother used to cook like this." Geneva reached through the window and touched the woman's hand. Just for a moment, just long enough to pass something between them, something that had no name but was as real as the wood frame of the window and the smell of the food and the light on the sidewalk. Something that connected grandmothers to granddaughters, past to present, lost to survival, and one kitchen window on Maple Avenue to every kitchen window where a woman had ever stood and fed her people with whatever she had. "Then she taught you well," Geneva said. "Now go eat before it gets cold." The line moved forward. The day went on. The sun climbed higher over Glenwood Park, warming the rooftops and the porches and the sidewalks where children played, and old men sat, and women carried their babies and their groceries and their lives from one end of the block to the other. Inside the house on Maple Avenue, Geneva Walker stood at her kitchen window and served plate after plate after plate. And the food was good, and the people were grateful, and the land beneath her feet was her own, and it was enough. The apron hung on its hook that evening, spotted with grease and dusted with cornmeal, still warm from the day's work. In the morning, she would wash it. She would hang it in the sun to dry, and next Saturday, she would tie it around her waist again, the same way she had done every Saturday for years, the way she would do every Saturday for years to come. The kitchen was quiet now. The children were in bed. The house settled around her with its familiar creaks and sighs. Geneva sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea steaming in front of her, and looked out the window at the dark street and the glow of the streetlight and the faint outline of the building across the way. She picked up the cup. The tea was sweet and warm, made with honey from a jar that Lorraine had bought at a farmer's market the autumn before she got sick. The jar was almost empty now. Geneva had been saving it, using it sparingly, one spoonful at a time, making it last because it was the last thing Lorraine's hands had touched in a store, the last small, ordinary purchase of a woman who did not know she was running out of time. But tonight, Geneva had used 2 spoonfuls. Tonight, she let herself have a little more. She sipped the tea. It was perfect, sweet and warm and made with love, the way everything in this kitchen was made with love, the way everything in this house had been built with love. From the first nail Cornelius Walker drove in 1945 to the last plate Geneva had served through the window that afternoon. The keys to the new deadbolt lock sat on the kitchen counter, small and silver, catching the light from the bulb above the stove. Geneva looked at them and felt their weight without touching them. New locks for old doors, new strength for old walls. The same house, standing where it had always stood, on land that had been taken and returned, on ground that remembered the footsteps of everyone who had ever walked across it and called it home. Geneva finished her tea. She washed the cup, dried it, and set it upside down on the rack. She untied her apron and hung it on the hook by the door. She turned off the kitchen light. She walked down the hallway, checking each bedroom as she passed. Keisha, asleep with a textbook open on her pillow. Amara, curled on her side, one hand under her cheek. Dante and Deshawn, tangled together as always, their breathing synchronized. Zuri, in her new bed, the star-shaped nightlight casting a soft glow on her face, peaceful and small and dreaming. Geneva stood in the doorway and watched Zuri sleep, and she felt something settle in her chest, something that was not quite joy and not quite peace, but was close to both. It was the feeling of a woman who had fought and won and lost and survived, who had buried the people she loved and raised the people who came after, who had stood at a kitchen window and served the world one plate at a time and asked for nothing in return except the chance to keep standing. She closed the door softly. She went to her own room and sat on the edge of the bed. On the nightstand, next to the lamp and the Bible and the reading glasses she needed now for everything, sat the photograph of Cornelius Walker, young, strong, proud, hammer in hand, standing in front of the house he had built with his own hands on land that was his. Geneva picked up the photograph and held it in the light.
"We kept it, Papa," she said softly. "We kept it all."
She set the photograph back on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and lay down in the dark. The house was quiet around her, the good quiet, the quiet of a place that is full even when it is still, the quiet of walls that have held a family through storms and kept standing. Geneva closed her eyes. Her knees ached. Her back carried its familiar fire, but she was home. She was home on her own land, in her own house, with her own people sleeping safe under a roof that no one could take. And that was more than enough. That was everything. Thank you for staying until the final moment. If the story touched you, please support the channel with a like.